Hello and welcome. This is a short presentation that I prepared for the World Summit on Counterterrorism at Reichman University in October of 2024. Sadly, the counterterrorism conference had to be cut back from 3 to 2 days, so I didn't give the presentation there. So I thought I'd give a brief overview and put it here on YouTube for the benefit of the attendance. So specifically, I'm going to talk about the international police response to the events of October 7, and in particular the role of Interpol. So Interpol has a long-standing involvement with counterterrorism. I actually wrote 2 papers about that. I will provide links to those in the description of this video. Particularly since the 1970s, Interpol gradually became more and more involved in counterterrorism, initially by focusing on certain crimes commonly associated with terrorism, and then eventually from 1998 onwards specifically on terrorism itself. Then in the wake of the events of 9/11, now more than 20 years ago, Interpol really took charge of counterterrorism in terms of international police cooperation, and the organization undertook various reforms of the organization. Here you see actually a picture of the Interpol website shortly after 9/11, and as you can see, the entire webpage and indeed much of the work in the organization was devoted to the fight against international terrorism, specifically Al-Qaeda at that particular time. However, what I also researched, and I again will provide a link to that paper in the description, is that from the 2010s onwards, Interpol took a lot less interest in terrorism. So I thought that was rather peculiar. Nonetheless, what happened after October 7 is rather staggering. Namely, there was no mention of the events of October 7 in Israel by Interpol at all. There was no recognition of the Hamas terrorist attacks at the General Assembly in November of 2023. There was no single mention by Secretary General Jürgen Stock about the events of October 7 since then, even though Stock has addressed other kinds of international terrorism that was responded to at the international level. So currently, if you go to the website, it's a very stark contrast with 9/11. So it's a very generic information and no specific mention of terrorism at all, except on a few dedicated pages. And then when Stock gave a speech at the United Nations about international terrorism, he only talked about Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, but not about Hamas. And when a question of him was asked about Hamas, he broke off his talk. The only statement that is at least Interpol related came from Interpol Washington, which condemned the Hamas terrorist attacks in response to a similar such statement from the U.S. Department of Justice. But so this was, let's say, part of the American response, definitely not part of international police cooperation at the level of the central headquarters of Interpol. Since October 7, the following mentions were made about international terrorism. In January, Stock spoke about Kerman terrorist attack and actually offered his support to Iran and to the Iranian authorities. He also met with police in South Africa to condemn international terrorism. And then in September of 2024, Turkish authorities actually sought to issue an arrest warrant against Israel. So this has been reported in the news. Here you see Stock offering his support for Iran, Stock meeting with police officials in South Africa, and then finally Turkey supposedly trying to issue an Interpol red notice for Israel's presumed, or rather alleged, involvement in a terrorist incident which was actually part of its military offensive. There have been some reactions and criticisms against this non-response by Interpol, specifically from the American Center for Law and Justice, as well as the Simon Wiesenthal Center and B'nai B'rith, which actually issued a call for Interpol to use its notices system against Hamas, but nothing has come of that. There has been some news reported about these efforts, but they have not been consequential in any way, shape, or form. So, What does all of this mean? So historically, Israel has had a very difficult relationship with Interpol. Basically, Israeli authorities don't really use Interpol very much, don't trust the organization. Requests by Israeli police to track Hamas are ignored. There is a private Israel law center which actually at some point tried to communicate to Israel that it should be used, didn't receive any follow-up as well. One of the peculiar difficulties in the relationship between Israel and Interpol is that Interpol has granted membership to the Palestinian Authority, or to what it calls the State of Palestine, since 2017. So this, of course, has been met with a lot of hostility from the Israeli side, and actually Interpol has received a lot of criticisms over the past 5 to 10 years, particularly for it being abused by autocratic regimes such as China, Turkey, as well as others. So Interpol, therefore, has been accused of ignoring important dimensions of international terrorism, which of course is totally contrary to the spirit of the organization, and which isn't, in fact, totally contrary to the reason of why Interpol was set up in the first place, namely to not be involved with any of these political difficulties, but to get to the practical work that is involved with having effective international police cooperation against the crime of international terrorism. So that has been very, very difficult. Particularly the leadership of Jürgen Stock has not done anything to prevent that. On the contrary, Interpol has been accused of cooperating with politically suspect regimes, to put it mildly, and therefore has not been serving the cause of international police cooperation. So again, Interpol has only been involved in international counterterrorism when it concerns Daesh or ISIL. So perhaps this interest itself is also politically shaped. And if we look at what has Interpol itself done, well, if we do a search for the head of its counterterrorism office with Hamas online, there are no results. So in other words, this silence of Interpol on Hamas is very striking. One has to include that it is deliberate. What the consequences are in terms of the role of international police cooperation in matters of terrorism remains to be seen. But clearly something would have to be done to the organization in terms maybe of American participation for international terrorism to once again become a central focus in Interpol. So that's about it for this talk. So in the description of this video, I provide additional links to related writings which you can consult. Thank you.